when that movie came out. Was anything cut from that film?
The studio actually legally couldn't trim it. They couldn't cut anything.
There is a moment in the final sequence of Blazing Saddles that most people have watched dozens of times without ever truly seeing it. Not a joke. Not a stunt. Not something written in any version of the script. It is a real person, a completely ordinary man in a plain sweater, walking calmly through the middle of one of the most chaotic scenes in Hollywood comedy history. He is not an actor. He is not a crew member. He has no idea a film is being made. And yet there he is, preserved forever on screen, strolling into cinematic history by accident. What makes this moment so extraordinary is not just that it happened, but what Mel Brooks decided to do about it. When his crew pointed out the stranger in the shot, Brooks did not call for a reshoot. He did not call for the editors. He looked at the footage, reportedly said the equivalent of leave him in, had the man sign a release waiver, and moved on. That decision, as small as it sounds, is the perfect window into how one of the most important comedies ever made actually came to exist, and why, 50 years later, it still hits harder than almost anything Hollywood has produced since. To understand why that blooper matters, you have to understand what kind of film Blazing Saddles really was, and what kind of world it was made in. The year was 1974. The Vietnam War had just ended in disgrace. The Watergate scandal had shattered public trust in government so completely that Richard Nixon would resign the presidency that same summer. The idea for Blazing Saddles originated with a story outline written by Andrew Bergman, who originally called his draft Tex X, a deliberate play on the name Malcolm X, with Alan Arkin attached to direct and James Earl Jones set to play the sheriff. That version fell apart, as so many Hollywood projects do. But Mel Brooks saw something in the concept that nobody else could quite see yet. He described it as hip 1974 talk happening in 1874 in the Old West, and he purchased the rights from Bergman before assembling a writing team with one very specific instruction. He posted a large sign in the writer's room that read simply, "Please do not write a polite script." What followed was not a traditional development process. By Brooks' own account, Blazing Saddles was more or less written in the middle of a drunken fistfight, with 5 writers all yelling loudly for their own ideas to be put into the movie. One of those voices belonged to Richard Pryor, who was already widely recognized as the most daring and fearless comedian of his generation. Pryor brought a sharpness to the racial satire that nobody else in that room could have provided. He understood, from lived experience, exactly how to write jokes that cut through polite society's comfortable fictions about race. According to film historian Scott Saul's 2014 biography Becoming Richard Pryor, when Pryor arrived at the Warner Brothers building to join the writing team, he settled into his chair, listened to Brooks explain the concept, and proceeded with remarkable nonchalance throughout the process. His contribution to the script was foundational, particularly in shaping the character of Sheriff Bart into someone who was not just the hero of a comedy, but a man fully aware of the absurdity of the world he had been dropped into. The original plan was always for Pryor to play that character. Brooks later acknowledged that by early 1972, he had moved away from those plans, though for years the public story emphasized concerns about Pryor's insurability due to his history with substance-related incidents. Whatever the precise reason, the role eventually went to Cleavon Little, a Broadway-trained actor who had not yet made a major mark in Hollywood. That casting change, which must have felt like a crisis at the time, turned out to be one of the film's hidden strengths. Little brought a different kind of energy to the role, cool, polished, and slightly detached, with a performance that was measured, ironic, and full of dry charm. Where Pryor might have brought combustion, Little brought precision, and the racial satire sharpened considerably because of it. His stillness in the face of absurdity made the absurdity even more visible. The casting chaos did not stop there. Brooks initially offered the role of the Waco Kid to late-night television host Johnny Carson, who turned it down. The role then went to Gig Young, an Oscar-winning actor with a long dramatic career. Young had the weathered look and the dry delivery that the character seemed to require. But on his very first day on set, during the scene in which the Waco Kid is discovered hanging upside down in a jail cell, it became clear that something was badly wrong. Young was experiencing alcohol withdrawal, production halted, and Brooks was left needing a last-minute replacement. He called Gene Wilder, who had already worked with him on The Producers and who had the kind of loose, instinctive brilliance that the film desperately needed. Wilder didn't ask to read the script, didn't ask questions, simply got on a plane, and was on set the next morning. His performance as the Waco Kid, a washed-up gunfighter with a drinking problem and an unexpectedly gentle soul, would become one of the most beloved elements of the entire film. The ease between Wilder and Little, their immediate chemistry, their perfectly calibrated contrast of temperaments, gave the movie the emotional grounding it needed to survive its own relentless chaos. That chaos extended all the way into the film's most famous sequences, including one that, at the time, had never been attempted in mainstream American cinema. The campfire flatulence scene was the first fart joke in a major studio film, and it turned an early test screening around entirely. Studio executives had sat in silent horror at an early cut, convinced they were watching a disaster. The head of distribution wanted to dump the film and take a loss. But Brooks pushed for one more screening, this time for regular Warner Brothers employees rather than executives, and the reaction was completely different. The audience laughed so hard during the campfire scene that additional sound effects had to be added in post-production because the original jokes were being drowned out by the laughter in test screenings. Brooks went back and layered in more, because he recognized something the executives couldn't see. This wasn't cheap toilet humor. This was a direct attack on the mythology of the American cowboy, the clean, stoic, romantic hero that Hollywood had been manufacturing for decades. By showing those same cowboys as real, unglamorous, slightly ridiculous men who ate too much and suffered the consequences, Brooks was doing what the entire film was built to do, pulling back a curtain that polite society preferred to keep closed. The same instinct drove one of the film's most quietly brilliant decisions, one involving a man who never even knew he was participating in a comedy. Mel Brooks never told Frankie Lane, the legendary Western ballad singer who performed the film's opening theme, that Blazing Saddles was a comedy. Lane had spent decades singing the themes to dramatic westerns. His voice was rich, powerful, and loaded with genuine emotion. Brooks was looking for a Frankie Lane-type voice when Lane himself showed up at his office, and Brooks, realizing the opportunity, deliberately withheld the fact that the entire film was a spoof. Lane later recalled that he did not realize the film was a comedy, as he was not especially familiar with Brooks' reputation at that point. So he sang the title song with complete, unironic conviction, treating the lyrics as though they belonged to a sweeping frontier epic. According to accounts from the production, Brooks even considered coming clean at one point, but couldn't bring himself to do it because the performance was so perfect. Lane only discovered the truth when he saw the finished film at his local cinema, and reportedly found the whole situation hilarious. The result was an opening theme so earnest, so dramatically committed, that it functions as pure irony without a single winking note. The gap between the performance's sincerity and the film's absurdity is itself the joke, and it lands every time. Harvey Korman, who played the oily, scheming Hedley Lamar, brought a different kind of commitment to his performance. He played the character as though he were in a Shakespearean production, delivering his lines with theatrical precision and barely contained ego. One of the running gags in the film is that everyone persistently mispronounces his character's name as Hedy, a reference to the real actress Hedy Lamarr, and the real Lamarr threatened to sue Brooks over the use of her name, with the matter eventually settled privately. Corman's controlled performance, never quite tipping over into full parody, made the comedy around him hit harder because he refused to acknowledge it was comedy at all. Meanwhile, Alex Karras, who played the impossibly strong and dim-witted Mongo, was not a professional actor by trade. He was a former NFL defensive tackle who had played 12 seasons with the Detroit Lions and had been named to the All-Decade team of the 1960s. Brooks cast him because he needed someone physically imposing who could also deliver absurdist comedy, and Karras delivered something nobody could have scripted, a performance of pure, lovable, deadpan strangeness that turned what could have been a one-note gag into something genuinely memorable. Then there was Madeline Kahn, whose performance as Lily von Stupp became one of the most celebrated comedic turns of the entire decade. Kahn had been nominated for an Academy Award the previous year for her work in Paper Moon, and she brought an actor's full investment to a role that could easily have been played as straightforward parody. The film received 3 Academy Award nominations, including Best Supporting Actress for Kahn, along with nominations for Best Film Editing and Best Original Song. Kahn improvised generously throughout the production, finding moments within the written material that nobody had planned. Her breathy, exhausted performance of the song I'm Tired is a masterclass in playing comedy completely straight while allowing the audience to see exactly what is being satirized. And then there was the ending, and the man in the sweater. The final sequence of Blazing Saddles is one of the most audacious conclusions in the history of American comedy. The fictional story quite literally breaks out of its own fictional world, with characters punching through the walls of the Warner Brothers soundstage, crashing into an entirely different musical number being filmed on an adjacent stage, spilling out through the studio gates, and continuing the action on a real Hollywood street. Bart ultimately pursues Hedley Lamarr all the way to Mann's Chinese Theater, where he shoots him in front of the actual building, then buys a ticket to watch the end of his own movie inside the theater. It is a sequence that requires the audience to hold multiple layers of reality in mind simultaneously, the story, the movie within the movie, and the physical fact of the Warner Brothers studio itself. It was one of the earliest examples of this kind of self-aware, fourth-wall dissolving structure in mainstream American comedy, and it directly influenced everything from Ferris Bueller's Day Off to the entire Deadpool franchise. It was during this sequence, with cameras rolling and dozens of costumed actors spilling through the studio gates and onto the public street, that an ordinary man simply walked into the shot. He was not an extra, not a crew member, not part of any planned element of the film. He was a real pedestrian who had accidentally wandered onto the live set while the cameras were rolling, and rather than cut the shot or reshoot the scene, Brooks chose to leave him in. According to behind-the-scenes accounts, Brooks tried briefly to shoo the man away, but after several failed attempts, he had him sign a release waiver and kept him in the final cut. The man's casual, slightly confused presence, totally out of costume, completely unaware of the absurdity surrounding him, added one final, perfect layer of reality to a scene that was already dismantling the boundary between fiction and the real world. He became, without knowing it, the living embodiment of everything Blazing Saddles was trying to say. That the world outside the screen is just as absurd as anything happening on it. That the line between the story and the audience was never as firm as anyone pretended. Brooks has stated on multiple occasions in the decades since that Blazing Saddles could never be made the same way under a modern studio system, that its combination of subject matter, language, and satirical intent was only possible because of the specific cultural moment it occupied. He is probably right. The film exists at a precise intersection of creative freedom, cultural urgency, casting accidents, production chaos, and a director with final cut authority written into his contract who simply refused to blink. Warner Brothers executives laughed at almost nothing during the first executive screening and fully expected the film to be a disaster the studio would struggle to release. When a subsequent screening for regular studio employees produced the opposite reaction, the studio scrambled to change course. What had been positioned as a limited test release in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago exploded in popularity, with some theaters extending their runs indefinitely, and it became the studio's top moneymaker that summer. All of it, the casting disasters turned into gifts, the campfire scene that saved the film in testing, the theme song singer who never knew he was in a comedy, the improvised lines that became iconic, the Yiddish-speaking Native Americans who said something real about Hollywood's long history of reducing indigenous people to background noise, and yes, the random man in the sweater who just happened to be walking down a Hollywood street on an afternoon in 1973, all of it points toward the same conclusion. Blazing Saddles was not a carefully engineered product. It was a controlled explosion. And the blooper that nobody noticed for decades is not a flaw in the film. It is the film. A movie so committed to the idea that reality is stranger and more chaotic and more honest than anything a studio committee would approve, that it let a stranger walk into its final scene and never looked back.